So it is my great pleasure to introduce Catherine today. Catherine is a scholar, artist, designer, and hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. And her research lies at the intersection of technology, design, and social justice. She is and was involved in numerous projects, such as running reproductive justice hackathons, designing global news recommendation systems that I really encourage you to check on her website. Her 2020 book from MIT Press, Data Feminism, co-authored with Lauren Klein, charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. Also, I would really invite you to read the book. And as I found out recently, it is actually publicly available online and you can find it on the MIT Press website. We continue. So her art and design projects have won awards from the Tain Foundation, Turbulence.org, and the Knight Foundation, and are exhibited at the Venice Biennale and the ICA Boston. Catherine is currently an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She is also director of the Data and Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equality. And she is also the co-founder with Rahul Baharva of the platform databasic.io, a suite of tools and activities to introduce newcomers to data science. So now, without further ado, the floor is yours, Catherine. We are really happy to have you here.
Thanks so much, Joanna. All right, thank you all so much for welcoming me. The series sounds super interesting. I am going to share my screen. All right, you see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. All right, let me just put you all up here. I can see you. Great. So yeah, thank you for the warm welcome. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about Lauren Klein and I's book, Data Feminism, in particular, since your all's theme is the responsible use of data, which I think is very timely and important and is in fact more or less the subject of our book as well. And so Joanna gave me this nice introduction, but I do want to say that Lauren Klein is the co-author of the book. You should definitely check out her work as well. She's an associate professor, and she's a dual appointment between English department and the quantitative theory and methods department. And she does a lot of really exciting work using quantitative methods, but in the humanities. So sort of at this digital humanities field. And she's at Emory University. And I think the only last thing to say on this particular slide is that, like Joanna said, the book is available online, open access. And so if you go to our website for the book is datafeminism.io, you'll see a big button that says read the book, and that will take you straight to the publisher's open access version. So where we're headed today, I'm going to cover a little bit about our motivations for writing Data Feminism. I'm going to ground us in what is the definition of feminism that we're mobilizing in the book, because there are many feminisms and we like to be precise about the feminism that we're drawing from. And then I'm going to show you some of the examples that come out of the book and that hopefully, I think, relate to your all's theme of responsible uses of data, because one of the things we try to do is uphold, positive examples in which a kind of feminist ethics has been used. So kind of we like to try to show examples of like these principles of data feminism in action in the world. So that's the roadmap, and then hopefully we'll have nice time for questions and discussion afterwards. So Lauren and I see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's holding corporate and government actors accountable for basically making sexist, racist, classist data products. probably, since this is, you all are already talking about this, these are things you're already very familiar with. But for example, these are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, or that detect them only with really high error rates, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, child abuse algorithms that detection algorithms that punish poor parents, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, and more. And so, almost every day, or at least in the US every week, there's some example coming out, typically in the popular press, where it's like this or that algorithm or this or that product or system is biased. And then there's, I would say, still, even after at least 5 years of these kind of patterns of reporting happening, there's still this like shock and surprise, like, oh my gosh, the algorithm is biased. How is that possible that an algorithm could be biased? And in fact, the fact that these examples keep coming, and it's like the same shock and surprise sort of keeps happening, was one of the motivations for writing this book, as a way of trying to say, like, when you live in a racist and sexist society, it's very logical, in fact, that your information and data products would also result in racism and sexism. So trying to kind of get back to some sort of root cause analysis for this. But then the other motivation for writing the book was in a way to try to work to challenge some of the very heroic narratives around data and AI as well. And I think some of those are embodied in this quote that's at the top of the slide, which maybe you all have heard. So data is the new oil. Lauren and I would characterize this as a meme, because it's like a really interesting phrase that was coined in the mid 2000s, so earlier than I think many of us think, is like 2006 or something. And then it got real boosted by The Economist magazine, who in the early 2010s had this whole issue about data and wealth, and how data is the new oil, and so on. And it's important to say that when people are using this metaphor, they're using it in a good way. They're using it in a way that is related to profit, in the sense that data seems to them like an untapped natural resource, like oil, that can lead to profit once it's been extracted, processed, refined, mined, cleaned, and so on. And in fact, you can see that like the metaphors that we use to talk about oil are the same metaphors that we use to talk about data. But in fact, there's been pushback against this sort of heroic narrative about data, always sort of since the beginning, but it's been really growing, I would say, in the past 5 or 6 years, and even just in the time that we were writing this book. And this pushback has been coming from Black and Indigenous women of color, from white women, from Indigenous people, from immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, and more. Because they experience the same process of data extraction as just the same old oppression. So, instead of helping us to redistribute, social benefits in some way, or social resources, or address pressing problems that have to do with social inequality, in fact, and this pushback says, we are exacerbating, accelerating this same old oppression that has existed for, dozens, if not hundreds of years in various contexts. And so we put some of the work that was most inspiring to us as we were writing this book at the bottom here. This work is coming out from a wide range of fields, and it's coming out both from academia, from social movements, from artists, and in fact, that ends up being a lot of the work. Oh, and by journalists as well, investigative journalists. So that ends up being a lot of the work that we showcase in the book too. So we're not the first ones to say data is the same old oppression. But what we bring to the table is a focus on feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, and what that has to offer, how we're thinking about data ethics, and this, even just the sort of practice of data science, and so on. So just a kind of quick divergence, because this this kind of the same old oppression, this idea that data are the same old oppression, begs this question. And speaking out against the same old oppression, we like to make the point that this carries consequences. And there was recently this very high profile sort of consequence for speaking out and pushing back against the status quo. So folks here may or may not have heard of Dr. Timnit Gebru. She was until recently the co-lead of ethical artificial intelligence at Google. She's widely known for her scholarship in machine vision. She's also very well known for her work on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in the field of AI. She was one of the co-founders of Black in AI, which is a community for Black researchers in artificial intelligence. And so to make a long story short, she and her team at Google wrote a paper about the dangers of large language processing models. And then it was approved for publication at a conference. And it has to go through an internal review process at Google. Initially, the Google leadership approved it and it was fine. And then all of a sudden they reversed their decision and asked the team to retract the research paper. And Dr. Gebru asked for transparency. And in return, Google promptly fired her, or as her team said, they resignated her because she said she wanted answers or else she was going to resign. And they were like, okay, you're resigned, basically. So more than 2,500, so this caused a huge stir, I think far beyond what Google had imagined. More than 2,500 Google employees have since signed a petition, and 4,000 academics and AI researchers have signed a petition that you can see here. Some of the recruiting firms that Google uses to recruit Black people specifically into Google dropped Google as a client over this case. 9 members of Congress, US Congress, wrote a letter demanding accountability about this particular firing. But Google has not been forthcoming. There's no answer. And in fact, they've subsequently fired her co-lead, Margaret Mitchell, who's a white woman, a couple months later. So this treatment is really shameful. And yet at the same time, I recently wrote a piece with 2 colleagues at MIT pointing out that the way that Dr. Gebru was treated is not an isolated case. And in fact, it's sort of the reason why feminism is more necessary than ever before, and intersectional feminism in particular. So this piece we wrote is called The Abuse and Misogynoir Playbook, and describes how, in fact, the way that Dr. Gebru was treated is so common that it's a centuries-old playbook that is used against Black women who speak truth to power. So why does this case matter for AI and for the field of computer science? And then how does this relate to our book? So feminism as both theory and practice demands that we ask what we call who questions. And so these are questions that don't typically get asked under the purview of other sort of fields. And within their conceptual purview, they don't typically ask these questions. So these are questions like data science by whom, or data science for whom, data sets about whom, whose data is in the data set, and then who's looking at the data set to make which decisions about whose lives, and data science with whose values. So these are what we will call these who questions. So why are these feminist questions though? And so by the end of this presentation, hopefully you will understand why. But what we like to do is sort of level set a little bit about this word feminist, feminism, to tell you exactly which feminism we're drawing from in the book. So what you see here is an image. This is from the MTV Music Awards in 2014. And Beyoncé is the artist who's performing, and she projected the word feminist behind her. And she actually, in her song Flawless, has the dictionary definition of the term feminist. So feminist is a person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So what we get from this definition is that feminism is a belief, and it's a belief in equality for all genders. But if you are a person that believes in equality for all genders, you just need to look around and see that that world has not yet been realized, that equality for all genders is not the world that we live in yet. And so feminism implies that we take action to realize that world. So it's organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. So it's it's equality, a belief in equality, and it's political action to realize that equality. And then finally, feminism has a third definition, and this is that it's a set of theories and ideas. And this one's pretty exciting because what this means is that feminism is an intellectual heritage, meaning we don't have to invent anew, like every day. When we encounter these issues of social inequality, we don't have to invent everything for how to deal with it, how to think about it, how to analyze power and social inequality. We have this whole huge centuries-long heritage of feminist thinking that we can draw from. And these theories begin by thinking about sex and gender inequality. But then the past 40 years of scholarship, as well as our current political reality, have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the equation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and many more things. So this brings us to the idea of intersectional feminism. And we say in our book, is that really feminism in the year 2021, really it must be understood as being intersectional. And so you all may know this already, but I'll cover it anyway. Intersectionality is the term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. You see her here on the bottom right, the pink shirt. And she uses this term to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, such as gender. And so this is, she's writing specifically about Black women's experiences in the US context, and she's a legal theorist. And so she was writing in the late 80s, early 90s, is when this concept was sort of invented or articulated. And she was saying, you know, we can't just talk about sexism when we're talking about what Black women experience in the United States in terms of hiring discrimination. That's what she was writing about, because in fact, they're experiencing both sexism and racism at the same time. And those two structural forces intersect and combine in sort of non-linear ways. And you cannot necessarily disentangle them and say, well, this part's related to gender and this part is related to racism. So it's the work of women of color feminists like Crenshaw and like her predecessors and Black feminists in particular that have really foregrounded this conversation about forces of power. Because what we get from intersectional feminism, this idea that we need to expand and consider other forces of oppression, that means that we kind of expand out from feminism just being about women. So it's not only about women. It's not only even about gender. She's writing at the time about racism and sexism. So that expands our analysis to truly an analysis of power. So who has power and who doesn't, based on which forces, both historical and present. In today's world, so intersectional feminism is about power. In today's world, data is power. And you can see this just in a real material sense, based on which are the companies that have the most money right now. Like literally it's the companies that have the resources to collect, store, maintain, mobilize, analyze, deploy large amounts of data. So intersectional feminism, basically the underlying argument of our book is that intersectional feminism, when it's applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. And in fact, our argument is that data science needs feminism, and it needs intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances. So in writing the book, Lauren and I sort of looked across our own formation, our own backgrounds, and then we also did a scan of many different literatures. So one of the exciting things about feminism, once you go start looking for it across a range of fields, is that it's really everywhere. It may be pretty niche in certain places, but there's almost always feminist work in pretty much every field. And we looked across a lot of the scholarship, also a lot of activist work. We particularly focused on fields that had a connection to kind of design or implementation or operationalization of some kind. So like legal fields, for example, human-computer interaction, geography and cartography. Like we particularly tried to look at where folks had tried to like take feminist theory and operationalize it or use it, apply it in some way. And from that, we came up with these 7 principles that for us encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data and data science. And so I don't have time to go through all of these today, but this is maybe important to say, like, this is how the book is structured. So each chapter, there's 7 chapters in the book. Each chapter is about one of these principles. And what we try to do in each chapter, one of our goals was to try to write in a really accessible way. So to not assume folks had any kind of background in like women's gender sexuality studies, also not assume that people had any background in data science or any kind of technical fields. And so what we try to do is in each chapter, we introduce the reader to the thinkers and theorists behind the formation of that principle, like who are the main sort of philosophers or scholars who have articulated this. And then we also try to introduce folks to people in current day, everyday life who are actually doing these things with data science, with the goal being to provide models for people who want to work with data in a more feminist or justice-oriented way. So, oh yeah, and I think the only last thing I'll say on this slide is you'll note that there's actually 2 chapters about power, or 2 principles about power, and they're the first 2 chapters and principles. And again, this is because really at the heart of the feminist project is this focus on power, is this focus on analyzing unequal social power in any given context and understanding how it works to reinforce the status quo, which is unequal, and as well as how we can challenge that and when we can challenge that, and what are our strategies for doing so. So from here, I'm going to go into some examples from the actual book and kind of show you what this looks like in action for some of the projects that we talk about. So in the very first chapter, where we're talking about examining power, we talk about projects like Mimi Onuoha's Library of Missing Data Sets. So this is this term missing data sets. This is a term that was coined by Onuoha, and she uses it to describe data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But for various reasons, these data sets do not exist. So these are things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, or for a more topical example, a gender and race breakdown of the number of people vaccinated for COVID in the United States. So Onuoha exhibits this library as an art project. So she's an artist, and the art project is what you see here, this white filing cabinet, and you can open it up. If you see it in the gallery, you can open it up. At the top of each folder is the sort of description of every missing data set. And so you can actually like go through these and read the descriptions of them. And then you can open up you can take out the folder and open it up, but then of course there's nothing inside because we have no records. We possess no records about this particular topic. And Onuoha writes really eloquently about why they're empty, and connects this to this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So collecting data, maintaining data takes money. So who has the ability to do that and who does not? So governments have this power, moneyed institutions, corporations have this power. More often than not, women and other minoritized groups do not have this power. And so one of the points this helps us make is thinking about how, while we are having lots of conversations about debiasing algorithms, looking at bias that exists in algorithms, looking at bias that exists in data sets or benchmarking data sets, et cetera. These are very important conversations to be having, but it's also important to remember that this bias gets introduced long before we even have data, because it affects what we do and do not collect data about, what we do and do not consider important enough to measure. So this is why a feminist approach to data science begins with this analysis of power, because this helps us spot these gaps at every stage of the process. So this next example comes out of the second chapter. So this is about challenging power in the second chapter. And in this chapter, we talk about the work of Maria Salguero. And this work, in fact, has to do with the topic of feminicide in the Mexican context. So for those of you who don't know, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. And feminicides are the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. So you can look at the hashtag Ni Una Menos to see how this has been unfolding, at least in social media space. There's been many protests in Latin American countries since 2014, 2015 at the very least, although the issue is, of course, much older than that. And in fact, many states, including Mexico, have passed legislation so that are actually, they've criminalized feminicide in 18 Latin American countries. However, the state still does not systematically collect data on feminicide. So although it's criminalized it actually doesn't know what the scope and scale of the problem is, and it also hasn't trained folks on the ground, like law enforcement, medical examiners, and so on, to properly classify deaths as feminicide. So Maria Salguero, who is basically just a person, she tells us that she's not an activist, she's like a citizen, basically, of Mexico. She was very frustrated by this lack of action. She has single-handedly compiled the largest archive of feminicide in the Mexican context. So she decided to just like go straight towards this problem of missing data and collect the data herself. And in fact, she's been doing that for 6 years, which is pretty incredible. So she spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging these feminicides on a Google map that she gets from reading news reports from all over the country. And then using her data set and her map, she's helped families locate loved ones. She's provided the data to journalists and NGOs for analysis. And she's been called to testify in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. And so in the book, we talk about this work as what you might call feminist counter data. So this is a kind of an activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this represents one way to use data to challenge power. And then there's like an important caveat to this though, which is that for any given problem of social inequality, collecting counter data is not necessarily always the right answer, right? Because we have to really think about the imbalances of power in the collection environment, and again, come back to those who questions. So like, who has data about whom? So for example, you can imagine in the context of the United States, we don't know how many undocumented immigrants there are, right? But a project that will go out and collect all the undocumented immigrants could actually pose a huge risk to those same people themselves if that available were made either public or available to the US government, who then may want to target them for deportation or other things. So these are some of the sort of tricky things that we have to navigate. So like more data is not always the answer, right? So in the book, we also talk about data from the standpoint of process. And so this project has to do more with the process and in effect, who is involved in a data science project, who gets to ask the research questions and who does the work. And so this is one that's been undertaken by the San Francisco Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which you can see here. So this is a community-based organization. It has a number of chapters around the United States. And they work in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups. And they work to quantify and also qualify, because they use both quantitative and qualitative data, the eviction crisis in the Bay Area and the other places they work. And so for this map, the red dot on the map indicates a place where a person or family was evicted. And then the blue dots indicate places where the AEMP has also interviewed some of the people who have been evicted from that place. And so there's this really interesting work to both quantify the scope and scale of the crisis, but also, you know, one of the things they realized early in their work was that putting an eviction as a kind of point on the map, they felt really reduced the sort of lived experience of being evicted, of like, what does it feel like to be evicted? What happens to people that are evicted? And so their way of rectifying this was doing these oral history projects, which they then digitized, where they had interviews with evicted people and families. And so that's what this photo of Phyllis Bowie, this is one of the interviews in their project. And so in the book, we contrast this very sort of collaborative, very grounded way of working, very participatory way of working, with the process of the eviction lab, which is based at Princeton University, which is ostensibly about like the very same topic. It's about evictions. So the eviction lab's goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And so this is a worthy goal. This is also a worthy project. We're not trying to like slam the project in this sort of unqualified way. But this project is very different in terms of its process. And so instead of working with community-based organizations to collect data on the ground, the eviction lab went out and purchased data from national real estate databases. However, the AEMP has shown that national real estate databases, like the ones that Eviction Lab draws from, significantly undercount evictions. And so, this is the challenge, of when you change scope and scale. And in fact, this also led to some tensions, because when Eviction Lab first started their work, they tried a strategy of partnering with organizations, and they actually approached the AEMP and asked them for their data. But when the AEMP expressed some hesitation, Eviction Lab wanted to move quickly, so they're like, okay, whatever, they moved on and then purchased the data in a quicker way. And so there's a public piece that was written by AEMP along with some other housing rights organizations about the expressing doubts about the Eviction Lab's data practices. So in effect, if what your goal is to quickly arrive at a national picture of evictions, maybe you do purchase these lower quality national real estate data sets. But what we're talking about here is process. And so through the grounded process of AEMP is sort of both valuing community knowledge, going more slowly, but also arriving at a much higher quality data set. And so sort of thinking about what is gained by embracing pluralism is this greater quality, greater context, greater relational ties to the communities that you're actually trying to serve with these data. So in that chapter, the Embrace Pluralism chapter, we talk a lot about participatory process. So there's a lot of fields that have participatory models as ways of working, right? It has not yet been the norm in sort of data science or systems development to date, but it's not to say that it couldn't be, right? So how do we think about participatory process for data science? And a feminist answer to this, is pretty explicit, like, thinking about like whose participation we prioritize the participation of people who have been most marginalized by the system. So this is sort of following the work of people like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Xiaowen Barzel in HCI. It really centers the experiences of people at the edges and the margins first to make design decisions. And this is very in line with the, if you folks have heard of the design justice, there's both a book and a network, and very in line with their principle, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. All right, so the previous examples have focused on the issue of power and people, but then feminist theorists have also addressed these more conceptual structures of power. And in particular, they've critiqued binary structures of power a lot. This comes from kind of the deep thinking and theorizing that's been done about the gender binary specifically. And so there's lots of amazing feminist work to draw on, but a kind of simple synthesis of this is that feminist thinkers are very skeptical, deeply skeptical of binaries. And they say, like, first of all, binaries are often false. And so we can think about the gender binary in this regard, right? If we inherit this idea that there are only men and women, In fact, that's a false binary, right? Because we know empirically speaking that there are more than two genders. So first of all, there's this kind of move to say, let's be suspicious of binaries because they're probably false. And then also, secondly, let's be suspicious of binaries because they're also hiding hierarchies. Because if we think about the gender binary, like there's men and there's women, in fact, they're not like on an equal playing field. It's like there's men and there's women here. So binaries are often hiding hierarchies and they're often empirically false. And so one of the key moves of feminist theorists is to take this kind of critique of binaries and use it to question other binaries and other hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So these are things like nature and culture, subject and object, or the example that the next one takes up is the artificial distinction between reason and emotion. So in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion, again, like a hierarchy, right? And so we see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. So we've sort of best practices for data visualization often involve excuse me, a clean design, a very minimalist aesthetic, a very neutral presentation of the data at hand. But in our principle about elevating emotion and embodiment, we say, why? Why are these our best practices? Especially when research shows that we interpret these as aesthetic choices and we interpret these just as emotionally, meaning we tend to believe that neutral charts are more truthful than they actually are. And if you're interested, there's a great paper about COVID-19 visualizations by Crystal Lee, who's a colleague at MIT. And she and her team looked at the ways in which COVID-19 misinformation was being propagated by folks using this same sort of aura of objectivity, this like clean minimalist aesthetic to try to be very neutral in communicating the facts, except the facts they were communicating were sort of like anti-masking, anti-vaccine, anti-everything that the public health establishment was saying at the time. So it's highly politicized, basically. So in the book, Lauren and I say, what about inviting emotion in? Now, we're like exiling emotion. What happens when we invite emotion in to the design process? And we use this example to talk about what we gain when we elevate emotion. And so these are screenshots actually of an animated visualization, and it's a visualization of gun deaths in the United States. Each arc that you see on the screen represents one human life. And while they were alive, their arc is orange. And when they are killed by gun violence, their arc turns to gray. And these are traced one by one on the screen. And you have to wait several minutes for these to all get traced out because there are many, many arcs. And then all the gray area represents the number of years these people would have lived. So there's this really interesting framing that we see how many people were killed by gun violence in just 1 year. And then we also see this really interesting sort of speculative statistic about the number of years that were stolen collectively from these people. So methodologically, it's no less statistically sound than any other study. The projected lifespans are determined using a statistical model, which relies on data from the WHO. But when this data visualization first came out, it was viewed with a lot of suspicion by the visualization community because it made us feel like the main appeal here is to emotion, and mainly the emotion of loss and grief. But then a feminist approach here would say this is not a problem at all, that it made us feel things. In fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason and emotion. You could actually say it's a more ethical, you could argue it's a more ethical visualization because it's representing human lives and what they sort of mean to us, not only as little ticks on an axis or little dots on a map or something like that, but actually trying to get at this more profound loss and aggregate that we have experienced. So rebalancing emotion and reason opens up our data communication toolbox and allows us to focus on what truly matters in the design process. All right, so I think we're gonna wind it up here. Maybe the final point that I'll make is, which is probably obvious from these examples, but just to reiterate it, data feminism, we really insist in the book on an expanded definition of both data visualization and data science. And so our data science is not defined by the size of the data set. It's also not defined by the credentials of the people undertaking the work. These are concerns that are continuously used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than just purely technical. But what we gain if we expand our definition of data science and who is a data scientist, and what we're interested in is this intersection of data science and justice, then we can see that some of the most exciting work today is being undertaken by artists, journalists, humanists, community organizers, activists, librarians, civic actors of various kinds. And some of this work does look like traditional data science, but some of this work is in the form of interactive sculptures, or it's in the form of data journalism, or it's in the form of these amazing data murals that you can see on the bottom of this screen that are produced in collaboration with community groups. And so one of the things that we do is we really try to tell a lot of stories and use a lot of examples in the book, because while we recognize that data is at the root of many problems today, we also feel like it can be part of the solution. And then just a shout out, if you like infographics, we were asked to put our book in several art exhibitions. We didn't really know how to exhibit a book. So we worked with a designer named Marcia Diaz to create these data feminism principles infographics. And we have them for download for free in a bunch of languages. You're very welcome to go check them out and download them. And then a bunch of new languages are going to be published this summer because folks reached out and from the internet and wanted to translate them. And so that was wonderful. So that's all I've got. Here's a ton of ways to be in touch with Lauren and myself. And we're always interested to hear, how people are using the work, questions, concerns, and so on. So yeah, I look forward to hearing you all.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for the talk. Very insightful, a lot of examples that we can think about. Until we get questions from the audience, I would like to, so when you mentioned the eviction project, that was actually very interesting from my perspective, because as I said, in our group, we work a lot on human computation, and one side of human computation are citizen science projects, where basically citizens are asked to help us to generate certain data sets. There are quite a lot of examples that are very successful, for example, to gather a data set of sounds from the city, to annotate images of stars. I think one other example that is very well known is about protein folding, where actually people were able to find proteins that are useful by asking people to help them. And I'm wondering to what extent you think this could work in such situations that are more likely to have social issues or ethical issues. As you said, you can't really make a database or a free database with people that don't have the rights to stay in a country.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think there is some power in these models, certainly. And there's sort of existing models, like, for example, the anti-eviction mapping project recently, like last year during COVID, started like a crowdsourcing project to try to get folks to, they're very interested in what they call landlord technology. So they're trying to get people to crowdsource when they see these landlord technologies. And so these would be everything from like security cameras on the outside of buildings to keyless entry systems to various biometrics on rental properties and things like this. So I mean, I think there's definitely some examples there. In my own lab, we're actually working with, so this example I talked about with the feminicide data collected by Maria Salguero, it turns out she is not the only one. In fact, my lab has been interviewing a lot of data activists across Latin America primarily, but also in other countries, who are collecting the same data using very similar means, sort of looking through news articles and social media feeds, and then assembling their databases from those sources. I think where, for me, the ethics part involves like, sort of what is the relationship, like who is collecting for whom and to do what, and what, because like sometimes even the citizen science projects can be read as kind of being extractive. Like it's like a kind of way to get free mechanical Turk labor for your project or something, And now if people derive benefit from it and they do it, then, maybe it's fine, like, so, you can say that it's not like people are forced to observe something and submit it to a project or something. So like if they're opting in, like I don't see a huge problem with that. But I think there are ways in which it can be more extractive and ultimately like also just less successful from an engagement standpoint, because like why would people participate in such a thing? And so like one of the things we are trying to do with our project about the feminicide data is, rather than like, I don't know, you could think about the eviction lab model as like they've positioned themselves as being the one big database to aggregate everything, right? And that's how they've positioned their value, right? In contrast, what we're trying to do in my own lab with feminicide data is we're working with people who are already collecting the data on the ground, who have contextual knowledge of their local environments, and who are doing that work. And we're building technologies to support their labor. And we're not taking their data. like our goal is not to have their data and offer it up with some kind of systematic analysis. Our goal is to actually infrastructure and support the work that's already being done, because there's a real lack of that kind of support. And often these, the citizen sort of feminist data or feminicide data collectors are operating in an environment with very little resources. So there's very little to sort of infrastructure and sustain that work. So I think that's where some of the fundamental tensions are arising, is like, and that's why Eviction Lab got into this tussle with the AEMP, is because they kind of went to them and just like wanted to get their data, they're just like, give me your data. And AEMP was like, whoa, we really are working to try to protect people on the ground. We also don't want our data to fall into landlords' hands. Can you guarantee us those things? And then Eviction Lab just didn't want to be bothered by those conversations and just went off and like purchased their data. And so I think these are some of these ethical tensions of like, who's doing the work and how do you honor the work and recognize the work of the people that are already doing the work. You know what I mean? And you're not just like a academic parachuting in being like, oh, I'm going to get the biggest database of all. If that makes sense. So I don't know that that answers your question, but I think there's a lot of interesting ethics of participation that arise as we do these projects on a large scale that involve participation, engagement, crowdsourcing, and so on. And I think there are more and less ethical ways to do those things, even if like the ultimate outcome, like I actually think like the impact, the outcome of Eviction Lab's work is really important. Like I do think it like is important in the United States context to have a national database of evictions, and they're very explicit about how their data are still incomplete and so on. But still, it's like the process by which you acquire that data matters, and the people with whom you partner matters, right?
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed. We do have a question now that I think you slightly answered, but I'm going to mention it anyway. So before the eviction project, you talked about power structures, let's say, and you said that sometimes is not always the best option to have more data, which indeed it's clear, but what do you think could be a solution to do this without endangering the lives of people?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways, and in fact, actually we can stick to the topic of evictions because like this is, it was very on my mind because I'm working with a PhD student who that's his dissertation work is about evictions. But, eviction in the United States context is deeply racialized, for example. So far more people of color than white people are evicted. And in fact, far more women of color are evicted, just really high disproportionate rates. And yet, then when you add, so there are these new services that have come out called tenant screening services, and they're used by landlords to assess a renter's sort of past record, basically do like a background check on a renter to see if the landlord should rent to them. And so what's increasingly being done with these services is that they are harvesting both eviction and criminal records data as an input. And then it shows landlords, oh, does this person have a criminal record? Does this person have an eviction on their record? Both of which are highly racialized in the United States context. And so this has opened up these questions for us of like, do we want to have a national scale eviction database? Because in a sense, we do want to know what the scope and scale of the problem is. And that's sort of what Eviction Lab's work is about. But on the other hand, who should have access to that data, especially if these tenant screening services are going to use it to basically disproportionately exclude, show landlords this information about evictions and criminal history. So this is a very like salient topic here where it's sort of like on the one hand, we do want to know these things. And on the other hand, we want to make sure that they're used in a fair way. And so I think for me, those questions always, they come back always to who questions, where it's like in some cases, you do want certain people to have access to certain kinds of data, right? Even very sensitive data, such as about whether a person was evicted from their home or whether a person is undocumented so that they might provide them with services or supports of some kind. And yet on the other hand, we want to prevent other parties from accessing that information. So to me, this speaks more to governance practices and procedures around data and sort of thinking about, well, like, how do we ensure the most protections given our unequal system? Like, given that we know that, the US government has this long track record of treating undocumented immigrants really poorly, especially in the past 4 years or whatever. I personally, for example, would just never work on a project to collect that kind of information, because we also have to think about not only at the, you all are sort of, you're in human computation. So you're thinking like you do something for like a pilot project or something, or you make a system that's intended to be used in a certain way. But then, we also have to think about it from a policy or a governance standpoint of like, well, what happens when that system goes out in the wild, right? What happens when it's sort of misused? What happens when it's then falls into the hands of the US government, your great database that you had said, oh, just this should only be used by community groups or something like this. So we have to think about like, how do we put those sort of like governance structures in place to be able to govern who has access and when, and all of that necessitates this like deep understanding of the structural inequalities that are inherent to these data collection environments.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions, people that would like to ask? Alessandro, yes.
I wanted to ask a question, but Catherine, I think you've kind of answered that in your last answer. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. And I really like this kind of idea of this kind of bottom-up data science. I think it's really exciting. It actually, this I can talk for myself, it's very far from what I just usually do. Well, I work at the BBC, so it's that kind of a completely different type of organization. I was wondering whether you think that there is any role for the public service in these, in terms of facilitating this kind of approach to data science, etc.
Yeah. By public, do you mean government or do you mean other sort of quasi-public entities?
Well, just yeah, government in general, but I don't know, like I can think even like in our case, public service broadcaster, any public service, civil service organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think huge, and this is actually why, for me, a lot of my kind of other strand of my work focuses on data literacy, actually, because I really feel like both of the like kind of risks and possibilities of new technologies are not fully understood by the public right now. And so like we really need an expanded public dialogue about data, AI, if we're going to answer all these complicated questions about governance and ethics, like we need a like stronger and healthier public debate, and we need a more educated people at the table, and we need people to not feel intimidated to be present there. Because a lot of times, like I do a lot of work with nonprofits, journalists, librarians, they often feel like, oh, I'm not technical enough. Like everyone feels, even somehow like data scientists feel like they're not technical enough to have conversations about AI. So like, I think on the one hand, we have to like strengthen that capacity. But then, and then on the other hand, so I think there's like powerful interventions that can happen in education to shift sort of how we think about technical systems and to consider them in a more socio-technical way, to like really show technical folks that it is their responsibility to be able to connect things to the social and political world. I think journalists, if you're at the BBC, journalists are playing a huge role in actually galvanizing some of these public conversations. And so in this, I'm thinking about data journalists specifically, who are using really interesting sort of mechanisms to audit algorithms. So thinking about the work like Machine Bias by ProPublica. There's work by Nick Diakopoulos on how to report on algorithms. The markup in the US is starting to do a lot of this sort of accountability reporting work on big tech. I think this is a really interesting sphere because like journalism, historically at least, has been a force that is about accountability. So it's about kind of taking those powerful forces like government and corporations and kind of holding them to task, auditing them in a sense, and so there's some really interesting work, I think, in process, and I think could be done, like again, there could be more of that being done as well. And then finally, yeah, I think I'm in an urban planning department, and again, from a data literacy standpoint, I think governments, and in particular municipal governments, again, we need to like think about how do we increase data literacy for them as well, because a lot of what we've been seeing in places like sort of like smart city developments and things like this is like there's a lot of vendors that are just like going directly to cities and making these wild promises of like, I can do such and such a thing for you and save you bajillions of dollars or whatever, which all sounds great to a city, but then they're making really uninformed decisions based on hype and then end up in these sort of smart city fiascos. And so really thinking about like how do we even just train up the city officials who are trying to make these decisions to understand when more public engagement, again, and participation on the citizen side is necessary for these things. So like, for example, there was a high profile thing here in Boston where the folks like had some software engineers like redesigned all the bus routes of the city, and then people were just enraged because there were all these things that just didn't make sense. Like they had kindergartners getting on a bus at like 6 a.m. and then they wouldn't start school till 8:30 in the morning or something, And so people like went to City Hall, were protesting like, F the algorithm and stuff like this. And so like, there are these situations where it's like, we need to figure out how do we bring, like this was not a bad thing to try to figure out how to do this algorithmically, but like how do we bring these parties together in a dialogue so that we can make a system that truly works for everybody and surface the concerns of like, hey, I don't want my kindergarten on a bus for 2.5 hours. Like that's very obvious concern, right? So, but we have to like figure out how to do that in the process of the design. So yeah. And I like your cat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, based on the answer that you gave, I was thinking about data literacy in combination with data visualization. And if you can tell us a little bit about your opinion, whether these two together can help people in critical thinking. So basically what I'm trying, instead of telling them this is good or it's bad, what you're doing is not correct, maybe give them a couple of details or information to make them reflect.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think the more that we can, think about, and I think actually starting with visualization is helpful because people find visualizations very compelling and powerful, and I've seen in my own work. So I was, prior to being at MIT, I was at Emerson College in their journalism school. And so I was teaching mainly people who didn't identify as being technical at all. Like they would say, I'm not a math person and things like this. But they would be very, they found the visualizations really compelling. They always felt really proud of themselves, even making just a very simple visualization. So I think visualization is a great kind of entry point to being able to have some of these conversations. But then I do think, like a critical approach is really necessary, really in both cases, really both for data literacy and for data visualization, because I think, again, from working with those students and also working with many like nonprofits and municipal government folks, non-technical people have a tendency to want to like trust numbers and spreadsheets, and there's like an inordinate amount of trust, and it often comes from lack of self-confidence. So it's that identification as not being a data person. So I'm just going to say, whoever collected that, they're smarter than me, and those numbers are probably correct. And so in a way, it's about like cultivating the same kind of skepticism that we, in critical thinking, that we cultivate in people when they're doing other things. Like if it's a more writing oriented person, like, you cultivate this kind of critical analysis as you read literature or something. Or if you're a journalist, you do fact checking on articles, right? It's a similar verification process, but it's sort of that teaching that as part of data science and data literacy skills, teaching that like sometimes numbers are not correct, sometimes there's missing data. What causes that? Let's look into that. Like, let's try to estimate that. Like, let's try to estimate like where are the missing data and how large of a problem is this for this particular data set and things like that. And there's lots of, in my own work, like there's lots of activities that you can run that get at those questions in a interesting and provocative way, and can have you talk. You don't always have to be talking about sexism and racism. So like even like in my class, we have an assignment that's about I send students out to just do data collection about types of shoes, and so they have to design a taxonomy for how they collect information about shoes, and then they walk around for 15 minutes and categorize shoes and log at least like 10 to 20 data points or data observations about shoes. And what inevitably surfaces is there's this huge variety in how people classify shoes, like what categories they write down, what kinds of color categories they use and things like this. And so it helps us get at this human constructed nature of data, kind of just breaking down this idea. It's often very simple ideas, but again, these are ideas we need to break down so that we can all come to the table and have more kind of robust democratic dialogue with many voices there. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. I think we are a little bit over time. So I would like to thank you once again for your talk and for all the insights and thoughts that you shared with us. It was very nice.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be invited. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And for the rest, I think we are going to see each other for the next talk.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.